The night pressed against me with a weight that felt almost physical, every shadow stretched long by the faint glow of a half-hidden moon. My lungs burned as I gasped for air, the metallic tang of blood sharp on my tongue, my blouse torn and sticky where crimson stains spread across the fabric. My brother, David Mitchell, only 3 years older, but with decades of cruelty wrapped inside his smirk, stood over me with his friends as though this moment was a show put on for their amusement. He had always been the golden child, the one shielded by our father's influence and our mother's blind loyalty, and now he was the executioner of my dignity. His voice carried the same authority it always had in our family, harsh, certain, as he growled that I was nothing, a burden, a weight he would no longer carry. My plea trembled out of me, barely audible, a desperate whisper for him to stop, to listen, to remember that I was his sister. But the concept of sisterhood had never meant anything to him. He shoved me hard into the dirt gravel grinding into my skin, pain flaring sharp along my ribs. His friends laughed their voices, cruel echoes bouncing through the trees. The sound of boys who had never been told no, who had never faced consequences. I remember the headlights blinding me for a second, the world flashing in stark white before darkness swallowed everything again. Then the engine roared, tires spun gravel into the air, stinging my face, and the truck shot forward, leaving me sprawled on the side of a dirt road deep in the woods. The red glow of the taillights burned in my vision as David raised his arm out the window in a mocking wave, his voice carrying over the roar of the engine as he called back that I was nothing, that I should never forget it. Then silence fell, the kind of silence that feels alive, weighting heavy with menace. I tried to rise my arms, shaking as I pressed my palms into the dirt, but my body screamed in protest. A sharp pain tore through my chest, each breath shallow and ragged. I knew something was wrong with my ribs, every inhale laced with agony. My hand brushed against my side, and the warmth that met my fingers confirmed the bleeding had not stopped. The forest around me smelled of damp pine needles, and the faint oily trace of gasoline, a reminder of the truck that had just abandoned me. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out the night sounds until suddenly, even the crickets and owls seemed to quiet, as if the whole world had turned away. I thought of screaming, but who would hear me? The nearest town was miles away. My phone had been taken, my wallet still in the truck. I was stripped not just of safety, but of identity. Tears pressed hot against my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I had cried too many times before, every time David mocked me, every time our parents dismissed my pain. Crying never changed the outcome. The sting of humiliation weighed heavier than the bruises forming across my body. I leaned against the trunk of a tree bark, rough against my back, anchoring me in place. I forced my breathing to slow, though every breath hurt, and told myself I had to think. If I gave in, if I let the cold and the blood and the fear consume me, then David would be right. He would have erased me as though I never existed. I told myself to move, one step, then another. My legs trembled beneath me, and I stumbled forward, gravel crunching beneath my shoes. Each step was a battle, each step proof that I was not finished. The dirt road stretched endlessly into the dark, lined with trees that seemed to lean closer, their branches clawing at my arms as I forced myself onward. My body wanted to collapse, to curl up on the side of the road, but rage flickered inside me. I could still hear David's laughter, cruel and triumphant, echoing in my head. That sound burned hotter than the pain in my ribs, hotter than the fear pressing at my chest. I repeated his words, the ones meant to break me, and turned them into fuel. If I survived, if I made it out of these woods, then one day I would prove to the world what kind of man my brother truly was. The cold gnawed at me, the night air slicing into my skin, but I clenched my teeth and pushed forward. My vision blurred stars dancing at the edges, but the roughness of the dirt beneath my shoes and the sting of bark when I caught myself against a tree reminded me that I was still here. My mother's voice haunted me, then sharp and dismissive, telling me I was overreacting, telling me that David was only protecting the family. My father's silence followed the silence of a man who cared more for appearances than for justice. Their voices made me feel small, as though even here, bleeding in the woods, I was somehow at fault. But another voice rose within me, quieter yet stronger, whispering that this was not my fault, that I was not overreacting, That survival was proof enough of my worth. I whispered to myself just to hear a human sound. You will make it, Naomi, one step at a time. My body was weak, but my will clung stubbornly to life. A coyote howled in the distance, chilling me, but I pressed forward, whispering again louder this time. You are not done. Not tonight. Each crunch of gravel was a declaration. I would not let my story end in the dirt where my brother left me, and in that moment, though the woods seemed endless, though the night pressed hard against me, I made a vow. If I survived, if I reached the light beyond these trees, I would gather every scar, every bruise, every photo, every word spoken by witnesses, and I would use them all. David Mitchell's cruelty would not vanish into silence. I would make sure it saw the daylight. And with each painful step forward, I carried that vow like a torch inside me, small but unyielding, guiding me through the darkness. The night in the woods had not begun there, not really, because the cruelty that led to it had been growing for years inside the walls of my childhood home walls that looked respectable to the neighbors, but carried echoes of rage and silence that shaped me into someone who learned early that speaking up was dangerous. My father, Harold Mitchell, was a man who carried himself with authority, the kind of man whose handshake and connections in the local council made him untouchable in our small town. He wore his role as a community leader like a badge, but behind closed doors he was a tyrant, quick with his belt when he thought discipline was necessary, quicker still with his voice when he wanted to remind us who held the power. My mother, Donna, was no savior, no buffer against his wrath. She had learned to survive by compliance, by nodding when Harold barked orders, and by scolding me if I dared to challenge David. To her, loyalty to the favored child and to her husband meant survival, and if that meant sacrificing me, then so be it. My brother David, 3 years older, grew up in that shadow, but instead of fearing it, he absorbed it like poison turned to fuel. He saw how Harold could smooth over anything with the police chief after a bar fight, how complaints from neighbors vanished with a single phone call, how our mother always defended him no matter how reckless he became. He learned early that rules did not apply to him and that his little sister existed only as a punching bag or scapegoat when his temper needed release. I remember being 10 years old when he locked me in the shed for hours because I would not give up my turn with the bicycle. When I finally escaped and ran crying to my mother, she did not hug me or scold him. She said only, "Stop being dramatic, Naomi. Boys will be boys." That phrase became the anthem of my adolescence. At 13, I came home from school with a science trophy, proud and eager to show my parents. My father glanced at it once, muttered something about wasting time on nonsense, and shifted the spotlight to David, who had scraped by with barely passing grades but was still praised as the future of the family. Every milestone I achieved was overshadowed, dismissed, or twisted into an insult. The gaslighting was constant. If David shoved me into a wall, I was told I must have provoked him. If he stole money from my wallet, I was told I should be more generous as a sister. If I cried after one of his outbursts, I was told to toughen up. These words drilled into me year after year until I began to wonder if perhaps I was the problem, too sensitive, too needy, too unwilling to accept my role as background in a family drama where David was always the star. The older we grew, the worse it became. By the time I was 20, David's violence was no longer childish cruelty, but something more menacing. He would shove me against walls, slap me across the face, twist my arm until I screamed. He always timed it when Harold was nearby, because he knew our father would never interfere. In fact, once, when I threatened to call the police after David split my lip, Harold laughed, patted his son on the shoulder, and told me no cop would waste time on a little sibling spat. He was right in one sense. The first and only time I did call, the officers arrived, but instead of listening to me, they looked to Harold, who assured them everything was fine. They left within minutes, telling me I should try to keep peace at home. That night, I realized just how powerless I was. It was not just David I was fighting. It was an entire system tilted against me, a father who manipulated a mother who minimized a town that believed appearances over truth. Financially, I was trapped as well. I worked part-time jobs, but my wages were taken to contribute to the household. Whenever I tried to save, my mother would demand the money for groceries or bills, claiming it was my duty. College had been a dream quickly crushed when Harold insisted we could only afford tuition for one child, and of course that child was David. I watched him squander his chance dropping out after a year while I served coffee at a diner and handed my paycheck back into the hands that belittled me. My independence was crushed at every turn. Emotionally, the toll was deeper still. Years of being told I was weak, of having every cry dismissed, every wound ignored, built a cage inside my mind. Even when I wanted to fight back, the voice of doubt whispered that no one would believe me, that even if I screamed in the middle of a crowd, the world would side with David. That was the insidious power of gaslighting. It made me question not just my worth, but my very reality. Looking back, I see now that this was how the trap was laid. Every insult, every dismissal, every instance of violence painted as my fault prepared the stage for the night in the woods. Because by the time David dragged me out of the truck, I had already been conditioned to believe escape was impossible, that justice was a language spoken only for others. Yet in the same breath, I must also admit that something inside me had begun to shift. I had started to keep small notes hidden away, little records of what David did, what Harold said, what bruises appeared, and when. It was not enough to free me then, but it was the beginning of resistance. A flicker of rebellion hidden beneath layers of fear. I tell this part of my story not to excuse why I stayed, not to justify the years of silence, but to help you understand how silence is shaped. It is shaped by parents who erase, by brothers who dominate, by communities that look away. It is shaped by power and money and fear. I did not stay because I wanted to. I stayed because every time I tried to reach for help, the hand I reached for slapped mine away. That is the foundation of abuse, and that is the soil in which David's cruelty grew unchecked until the night he decided abandoning me bruised and bleeding in the woods was not just possible but amusing. The breaking point did not arrive in a sudden explosion, but built slowly, a storm cloud gathering until the sky had no choice but to split open. For years, David and my parents had assumed my compliance was guaranteed, that I would sign whatever paper they pushed in front of me, that I would nod and stay silent as property and power flowed toward my brother. But when the matter of my grandmother's land came forward, something in me hardened. That piece of land, a modest stretch of soil on the edge of town with a crumbling farmhouse and apple trees that had fed me as a child, had been left to both David and me. It was the one tangible reminder that I belonged somewhere, that my grandmother had seen me, even if no one else in the family did. When Harold slid the transfer document across the kitchen table one evening, his voice calm but his eyes hard, telling me to sign so David could manage it, I shook my head. For the first time, I said no. The silence that followed was heavy. Donna's mouth tightened, her eyes flickering between me and Harold as though she had just witnessed a dangerous breach in the family order. David's laughter filled the room, mocking, certain I would cave within moments. But I did not. I said clearly that I would not give up my share. That refusal shattered the illusion of control they had always held over me. Harold's face reddened, his hand slamming against the table, the sound echoing through the house. He called me ungrateful, foolish, selfish. Donna muttered about how much stress I caused, how David only wanted what was best for the family. David's voice rose above them all, his words laced with venom as he accused me of betrayal, of standing in the way of progress. The argument stretched late into the night, but my answer never changed. I would not sign. The next day, David cornered me outside by the shed. His friends' boys, who had grown into men with the same arrogance and recklessness he carried, flanked him. They smelled of beer and cigarettes, their laughter careless as if this was all entertainment. David's eyes burned as he demanded again that I sign the papers. When I refused, he struck me across the face. Pain blossomed hot and sharp, but worse was the humiliation, the knowledge that my cries would carry no weight inside this family. His friends urged him on, egging him like spectators at a cruel sport. He shoved me against the wall, his hand gripping my throat for a moment before releasing a warning of what could come. I spat back at him, my voice hoarse but firm, that he could not erase me, that one day the truth would catch up with him. That defiance only enraged him further. He dragged me by the arm toward his truck, ignoring my protests, ignoring the way my body twisted to break free. He threw me into the back seat, his friends climbing in as though this was a road trip. My heart pounded as the engine started, the headlights cutting through the dusk. I begged him to stop, to think, to not do something he could not take back, but my words bounced uselessly against his fury. The ride was rough, the truck rattling along dirt paths that grew narrower, the forest closing in. My ribs ached from where he had struck me, my lip split and swelling. His friends laughed, recording on their phones, turning my terror into amusement. I realized then this was no longer about land or signatures. This was about control, about punishing me for daring to say no. When the truck jerked to a halt deep in the woods, David yanked me out his grip, bruising my arm. He shoved me hard and I stumbled, hitting the ground. Gravel bit into my skin. I tried to rise, but he pushed me down again, his boot pressing lightly against my side as if to remind me he could crush me fully if he wished. "You think you matter," he sneered, his friends cackling behind him. "You are nothing. You always have been nothing." I met his gaze despite the tears blurring my vision. For the first time in years, I did not lower my eyes. I told him he was wrong. I told him I would survive this. My voice shook, but the words landed, his face twisted rage mixing with disbelief that I could still speak back. He struck me again, the world tilting, pain exploding. Then he released me, stepping back, and with a mocking salute, he ordered his friends into the truck. I heard the engine roar, the laughter fading as the red taillights disappeared into the darkness. Alone, broken and bruised, I lay there in the dirt, the cold creeping into my bones. Yet even as fear pressed down, something fierce stirred inside me. If I lived through this night, I swore I would no longer play the role they had written for me. I would gather evidence, I would find allies, and I would not rest until David faced consequences for what he had done. That vow, whispered into the dark, was the moment the breaking point turned into resolve. The night pressed in heavier with every breath, and though pain radiated through my ribs and across my bruised face, I forced myself to crawl toward the faint hope of a road I thought might lie beyond the tree line. My palms burned where gravel had torn skin, my knees wobbled beneath me, and each step felt like dragging a boulder behind me, but something stubborn inside me whispered that I could not stop. Minutes blurred into an endless stretch of stumbling forward, my breath ragged, my vision swimming, until finally the canopy of trees broke and I saw the dirt road widen into a rough path. I collapsed onto the shoulder, my cheek pressed against cold soil, and for a moment I thought I might simply fade there. Then light split the darkness. Headlights rounded a curve, their beams bright and startling, washing over me in an almost holy glow. My heart lurched in terror at first, afraid David had returned to finish what he started, but the truck slowed instead of speeding up, brakes squealing as it came to a stop. The door creaked open and footsteps hurried toward me. A woman's voice, firm and startled, cut through the night. "Dear Lord, are you all right?" I blinked, struggling to lift my head. The woman who knelt beside me looked older. Her gray hair tucked beneath a wool cap, her weathered face lined with years of both hardship and kindness. Her name, I would later learn, was Evelyn Carter, 62 years old, a widow who hauled freight at night to keep herself busy and independent. She crouched, low flashlight beams steady as she examined the blood on my shirt, the swelling at my lip, the bruises that painted my arms. "What happened to you?" she demanded, not in disbelief, but in protective urgency. My throat was dry, my voice weak, but I managed to whisper, "My brother. He left me here." Evelyn's expression hardened, not skeptical like so many others had been when I tried to explain David's cruelty, but sharp with recognition that violence had taken place. She pulled a cell phone from her pocket with quick hands and dialed 911, her voice steady as she told the dispatcher she had found a young woman beaten and abandoned on County Road 17, that medical help was needed immediately. While she waited for the operator to respond, Evelyn shrugged off her thick jacket and wrapped it around me. Warmth flooded my body, bringing with it a surge of tears I had been holding back for hours. "Stay with me, sweetheart," she murmured, her hand resting gently on my shoulder. "Help is coming." I clung to her presence as sirens began to echo faintly in the distance. Within minutes, red and blue lights cut across the darkness, an ambulance pulling up behind Evelyn's truck. Paramedics rushed out, voices overlapping as they assessed my injuries. Questions fired rapidly, name, age, what happened, but my words came fractured, weak. Evelyn spoke for me, explaining how she had found me repeating clearly that I had said my brother left me. She insisted they take photographs of my condition before moving me, reminding them she had already captured images with her phone. Her foresight struck me even through the haze of pain. She was not just helping me survive this night, she was preserving the truth. At the hospital, fluorescent lights blurred overhead as I was wheeled into the emergency room. Nurses cut away my torn blouse, revealing dark bruises spreading across my ribs. X-rays confirmed fractures my lip, required stitches, and abrasions covered my skin. The doctor's face was clinical, but kind, reminding me that by law, these injuries would be documented and reported. For once, the system was not erasing me, but recording evidence that could not be brushed aside with my father's influence. Evelyn waited in the corner of the room, her presence steady, her jacket still draped across my legs. She refused to leave until she knew I was safe. When the doctor finally said I would recover with rest and care, she approached my bedside. "You are not alone anymore," she said simply. I could not speak without my throat closing, so I nodded, clutching the edge of the blanket as though it were the first anchor I had ever been given. Over the next hours, between nurses checking vitals and machines humming, Evelyn sat beside me, asking only gentle questions, my name if I wanted water, if I remembered anything else. She never doubted, never suggested maybe I had misunderstood, never excused my brother's actions. Instead, she pulled out her phone and showed me the photos she had taken. My face swollen, blood streaked across my shirt dirt in my hair, my body crumpled on the roadside. Proof that I had not imagined it, proof that this had happened. For the first time in years, someone outside my family believed me without hesitation. That night, lying in the hospital bed with pain thrumming through every nerve, I realized Evelyn had become more than a rescuer. She was a witness. She was the difference between silence and acknowledgement, between another buried story and a truth that could no longer be denied. And as I drifted into uneasy sleep, I clung to one thought. If I could gather more allies like her, if I could hold on to this evidence, then maybe, just maybe, I would finally find justice. The days that followed were a blur of hospital walls, beeping monitors, and the ache of broken ribs. Every time I breathed too deeply, yet through that haze, I felt something new taking root, something fragile but undeniable, the sense that maybe I was no longer trapped entirely in the shadows of my family. Evelyn visited daily, her quiet strength filling the sterile room with more comfort than any medication. When I was discharged a week later with bandages wrapped around my chest and instructions to rest, she did not simply drop me at the curb and drive away. She spoke with my Aunt Margaret Dawson, a woman I had barely known since childhood, and together they made sure I had somewhere safe to go. Margaret lived in a modest house near the coast, paint peeling on the porch, but filled with warmth, and she opened her door to me without hesitation. I remember stepping inside, the smell of bread baking in the oven, the soft hum of an old radio, and feeling as though I had stepped into a life that had been waiting for me all along. For the first time in years, I slept without fear of David pounding on my door, without the suffocating weight of my parents' silence pressing down. Recovery was not instant, of course. Each morning I woke, stiff bruises fading into yellow, but still tender ribs reminding me of every breath. Yet Margaret's gentle encouragement gave me permission to rest, something I had never been allowed before. She placed an old notebook on the nightstand one morning and suggested I write. Even if no one else reads it, she said, you will know the truth. So I began. Page after page, I wrote down everything, dates, incidents, words. Harold had spoken the exact time David shoved me into the shed, the way my mother dismissed my cries. It was not only catharsis, but evidence, carefully documented, each detail a stone added to the foundation of a case I had not yet realized I would one day build. Alongside the writing, I saved copies of every medical report, tucking them in a folder beneath my bed. Evelyn had given me a USB drive with the photographs she had taken, and I added them too. Slowly, my recovery became not just about healing wounds, but about constructing a record of survival. Margaret introduced me to the owner of a small cafe by the waterfront, a woman named Helen who needed help with morning shifts. Though my ribs still ached, I wanted to stand on my own feet to feel useful again. So I poured coffee-wiped tables and carried plates to customers who smiled kindly without knowing the storm I had walked through. At the end of each week, Helen paid me in cash, the bills small but weighty with dignity. For the first time in my life, I kept money that no one else could touch. I tucked some away in an envelope, a small act of independence that felt monumental. Emotional undulation carried me like tides. Some days I felt nearly whole, laughing with Helen's customers, writing in my notebook with steady hands. Other days the memories clawed back, the sound of David's laughter in the woods, echoing until I shook with rage and fear. On those nights, Margaret sat beside me on the porch knitting silently while I stared at the sea, and her quiet presence reminded me healing did not mean forgetting, but learning to live without being consumed. I began to take photographs of my own bruises as they healed, not because I wanted to remember the pain, but because I wanted undeniable proof of how far I had come. Each image was stored carefully on a second-hand laptop Margaret found for me, backed up on the USB drive Evelyn had given me. I had no plan yet for how to use them, but instinct told me they would matter. Evelyn herself became more than a rescuer. She visited often, bringing coffee from the gas station where she fueled her truck, and though she rarely spoke of her own life, her presence reminded me of resilience. She told me once that she had lost her husband to illness years earlier and had learned to survive by choosing not to disappear into grief. Her words struck deep. "You can disappear into what they did to you," she said one evening, "or you can use it as kindling to light your way forward." It became a mantra I whispered when the nightmares came. Over time, I noticed strength returning to my body. I could walk longer distances, lift heavier trays at the cafe, even laugh without pain tugging at my ribs. But more importantly, I noticed strength in my mind. I no longer flinched at every loud voice. I no longer believed I was worthless. The scars remained, but they became reminders rather than shackles. Margaret encouraged me to think of a future not just survival. She suggested classes at the community center, maybe even finishing the college education denied to me. The thought scared me as much as it thrilled me. For so long, I had been told my future did not matter, that every choice would be made for David's benefit. Now the possibility of reclaiming my own life seemed both foreign and exhilarating. I did not share all my thoughts aloud, but I carried them inside seeds waiting for spring. And beneath it all, I held tight to the vow I had made in the woods. If the day ever came when David tried again to erase me, I would be ready. I would not face him with empty hands and trembling silence. I would face him with records, with allies, with proof. That promise became the thread stitching me back together, the quiet strength that hummed beneath every ordinary day at the cafe, every quiet evening on the porch, every moment I chose to keep walking forward rather than look back. Life in Margaret's small coastal town settled into a rhythm that healed me more than I had expected. But even as the bruises faded and my ribs began to mend, I knew I could not fight the battle ahead alone, not against David, not against the power of Harold's connections or Donna's endless denial. My evidence folder grew thicker, photographs, medical reports, notes written late at night when memories clawed their way back. But evidence without allies felt fragile, as though one gust of doubt from someone in authority could scatter it like leaves. That was when I met Daniel Reed. He came into the cafe one rainy morning, a tall man with shoulders bowed slightly, as if carrying invisible weight, his dark hair damp, his hands rough from carpentry. He ordered black coffee, nothing else, and sat by the window staring at the sea with an intensity that made me wonder what storms lived behind his eyes. For weeks, he returned at the same hour, always polite, always quiet. Customers whispered that he had once been a police officer before leaving under circumstances no one fully understood. I tried not to care, but curiosity pulled me toward him, and one morning when I refilled his cup, he looked up and asked softly if I was new in town. Something in his tone carried no judgment, only interest. That small question opened a door. Over time, our exchanges grew brief at first, then longer, until one afternoon when the cafe was nearly empty, he asked why I sometimes flinched when a loud truck passed outside. My instinct was to retreat, to paste on the old smile and say nothing, but I remembered Evelyn's words about finding strength in allies. So I told him a piece of the truth, not everything, but enough. I said my brother had hurt me, that my parents had looked the other way, that I was keeping records now because I knew one day I would need them. His eyes did not widen with pity, nor did he dismiss me. He nodded, his voice steady, as he said he had seen too many cases where victims were ignored until it was too late. Then he leaned closer and explained something I had not considered: how to store my recordings, so they would not be dismissed as unreliable, how to back up photographs with timestamps, how to keep copies in multiple places. He told me that in court, preparation mattered as much as truth. That conversation changed everything. For the first time, I felt my efforts validated by someone who understood the system from inside. Daniel did not offer to fight my battles for me. He simply gave me tools. He showed me how to set my phone to record discreetly, how to email files to myself so they could not be deleted, how to keep a log with exact dates and times. It felt empowering, like building armor piece by piece. Slowly, trust grew between us. I learned that Daniel had left the force after refusing to stay silent about corruption in his unit, a decision that cost him his career but preserved his conscience. That choice made me respect him more because he knew what it meant to stand against powerful men and lose everything. In him, I saw not a savior, but a mirror of resilience, someone who understood the loneliness of speaking truth in a world that preferred lies. Our conversations became a lifeline. He never pressed for details I was not ready to share, but each time I revealed a little more, he listened without interruption, without disbelief. It was a startling contrast to years of gaslighting, and it chipped away at the internal voice that told me no one would ever believe me. Evelyn continued to visit too, her bond with me unshaken, but Daniel's presence added a new layer. Between the two of them, I felt the fragile beginnings of a team people who stood on my side not because of obligation, but because they chose to. That difference mattered more than I could explain. Still, the emotional tide rose and fell unpredictably. Some nights, I lay awake convinced that even with allies, David's shadow was too long, Harold's connections too deep. Other nights, I dared to imagine a courtroom where my voice would finally carry weight. The undulation was exhausting, but with Daniel's guidance, I kept building my case. Each bruise healed but left behind an image stored safely on multiple drives. Each memory I recorded became part of a narrative that could no longer be denied. Step by step, ally by ally, I was transforming from a victim left in the woods into a woman preparing for justice. And deep down, I knew the day would come when David would try to reassert his control. When that day arrived, I would not be alone. The quiet rhythm of my new life lulled me into a fragile sense of safety, days at the cafe blending into evenings on Margaret's porch, nights filled with the sound of ocean waves instead of slamming doors. And for a while, I let myself believe perhaps David had moved on. Perhaps the forest had swallowed his cruelty whole, but shadows have a way of finding cracks in even the strongest walls. It began with the feeling of being watched a prickle at the back of my neck. As I walked home one evening, the street lamp's flickering footsteps echoing faintly, though no one appeared behind me. I tried to dismiss it as paranoia scars shaping illusions, but a week later I saw him. David stood across the street from the cafe, leaning against a lamppost, his arms folded, a smirk pulling at his lips, as though months had not passed since he left me for dead. My breath caught my chest tightening with both fear and fury. He did not approach that day, only watched until I ducked into the back room shaking, but the message was clear. He knew where I was, and he wanted me to know it. When I told Margaret, she froze her knitting needles still in her lap, her face pale. She urged me to call the police, but memory of their dismissals in the past clenched my stomach. This time, however, I was not the same helpless girl. I had allies, I had evidence, and I had learned from Daniel how to protect myself. I charged my phone, checked the recording app, and promised myself I would capture everything. The next encounter came only days later. I was walking home after closing shift when headlights flared behind me. A truck slowed, and I recognized it instantly, the dented bumper, the familiar roar of the engine. My legs trembled, but I forced myself to stay calm, to hold my phone at my side and press record. The truck rolled up beside me, and David leaned out his face, half hidden by the glow of the dashboard. "You think you are safe here," he sneered. "You think a different town makes you untouchable. I will bury you in the woods this time, Naomi, and no one will find you." His voice was steady, confident, the same cruel tone I had known all my life. I kept walking through, my body screamed to run, and his truck crawled beside me like a predator playing with prey. Then, as if the night itself had conspired, headlights appeared behind us, another car approaching. David slammed the accelerator and sped off gravel spitting against my legs. My hands shook as I replayed the recording, his words etched clearly undeniable. When I showed it to Daniel the next morning, he listened in silence, his jaw tight, then nodded. "This is good," he said. "This is proof. Keep it safe. Back it up." Evelyn, too, witnessed his presence. One afternoon, she stopped by the cafe for coffee and later told me she had seen a man matching David's description circling the block. Her words steadied me, confirmed I was not imagining the threat. For the first time, the narrative was no longer just mine. Other voices now echoed it, yet the fear was real, rising and falling like tides. At night, I double-checked the locks slept with the USB drive tucked under my pillow, and still jolted awake at the sound of trucks passing by. Margaret urged me to move to hide further, but I shook my head. Running again would only prolong the cycle. If David wanted to corner me, then this time I would be ready. I would not give him silence. The undulation of emotions carried me from terror to defiance daily, but through it all, my evidence folder thickened each new page a small shield. It was not just survival anymore. It was preparation. The past had returned, yes, but I was no longer the same girl he had abandoned in the dirt. The next time we faced each other, I swore the world would see him for exactly what he was. The day came sooner than I expected, a late afternoon when the cafe was nearly empty, and the smell of brewed coffee hung heavy in the air when the door creaked open, and David walked in as if he had every right to step into the space I had built away from him. My heart thudded in my chest, but instead of freezing, I reached for my phone, my fingers steady as I activated the recorder. He smirked when he saw me, that same smirk from the night in the woods, the one that said he thought he still had the power to reduce me to silence. He leaned against the counter, his voice dripping with mockery, as he told me I looked healthier than I had any right to be, that maybe he should have finished the job when he had the chance. The words cut deep, but I forced myself to meet his gaze, my chin lifting as I said clearly that he would not intimidate me again. Customers at the tables stiffened, sensing tension, and I knew I had witnesses. My voice did not tremble when I said, "You left me in the woods, David, but it was there I found the strength to stand against you." His eyes narrowed, and for a flicker of a second he looked uncertain, as though he had not expected defiance. Behind me, Daniel stood silently, his arms folded, watching every move. Evelyn, too, happened to be present sipping her coffee near the window, and when she recognized David, her expression hardened. My allies were here not by design, but by the kind of fate that seemed to demand this confrontation happen in the open. David's voice grew louder, his anger boiling as he called me a liar, claimed I had always exaggerated, that no one would believe my story. But I only lifted my phone higher, making sure he saw the red light blinking. "It is not just my word anymore," I said, my voice steady. "I have recordings. I have photos. I have witnesses." The words hit him like a blow, and I could see panic flicker across his face before rage buried it again. He lunged closer, pointing a finger at me, his spit flying as he threatened to drag me back into the woods and end it for good, but his mistake was shouting it loud enough for every person in the cafe to hear. Gasps rippled through the room. Daniel stepped forward, his voice calm but firm, telling David to back away. Evelyn reached into her bag and pulled out her phone, snapping a photo of David mid-threat. For the first time, I was not cornered alone. For the first time, his intimidation turned into his own undoing. My hands shook slightly, but I kept my eyes locked on him, recording every second. The confrontation stretched into a tense silence until finally David snarled, shoved a chair aside, and stormed out the bell above the door, jangling violently as it slammed shut behind him. The cafe was left in stunned quiet, every eye on me. My knees wobbled, but I stayed upright, my chest rising and falling, with controlled breaths. Daniel placed a steadying hand on my shoulder, his voice low as he said, "You did it. You stood your ground." Evelyn approached her phone, held up with the photo she had captured, and she said simply, "Now we have more proof." Relief and fear collided inside me, emotional waves crashing, but beneath it all was a spark of triumph. The past had cornered me, yes, but I had answered not with silence, not with tears, but with strength and evidence and allies. David had tried to rewrite the script of my life once again, but this time the pen was in my hand. The trial began months later in the county courthouse, a building I had passed countless times in my youth, but never entered, always believing it was a place meant for others, for people whose voices carried weight. Never for me, a girl trained to be silent. Yet as I walked up the stone steps with Daniel on one side and Evelyn on the other, Margaret just behind us, I felt the weight of every scar and every night of fear press against me and transform into something sharper, something that felt like resolve. Inside the courtroom, the air buzzed with whispers. Reporters scribbling notes, townspeople filling benches, some out of curiosity, others out of disbelief that the Mitchell family pillars of our community facade could be dragged into the light. At the front, David sat stiffly at the defense table, his jaw clenched, his expensive suit unable to disguise the restless tapping of his foot. To his right, Harold and Donna sat with cold expressions, their eyes darting toward me like daggers, as if by glaring hard enough they could reduce me once again to the frightened child who obeyed. My attorney, a woman named Claire who specialized in domestic violence cases, whispered reassurance as we waited. She reminded me that we had evidence medical records, Evelyn's photographs recordings on my phone witnesses who had heard David threaten me in the cafe, and that no matter how loudly the Mitchells tried to dismiss me, truth had a way of seeping through cracks. When the judge entered and the trial officially began, I felt the emotional undulation surge fear rising like a tide only to recede as I focused on the evidence folder in front of me, the tangible proof that my voice would not stand alone. The prosecution laid out the case methodically, describing how David had assaulted me, abandoned me injured in the woods, stalked me months later, and openly threatened me again in public. Each piece of evidence was presented with precision. The jury listened intently, their eyes flicking toward me as if weighing my humanity against the accusations. When Evelyn took the stand, her steady voice carried across the room, recounting the night she found me bleeding on the roadside, how she called 911, how she photographed my injuries and insisted the paramedics document everything. She held up her phone displaying the original images, and the courtroom screens projected them larger than life, my swollen face and bloodied shirt now undeniable proof. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Evelyn's words carried weight because she was not family, not bound by Mitchell loyalty or corruption, but a stranger whose compassion had made her witness. Next came the medical testimony. Doctors described my fractured ribs, the bruises consistent with blunt force, the mandatory reports filed under state law. Charts displayed my injuries clinical and cold, yet each line etched my suffering into the official record. Then it was my turn. As I stepped up to the witness stand, my legs felt like they carried centuries of history. Every silenced victim, every dismissed voice, every person who had been told family violence was a private matter. I swore to tell the truth, my voice trembling at first, then steadier as I began. I recounted the night in the woods, the shove, the laughter, the red taillights fading. I told the court how I crawled toward the road, how Evelyn found me, how fear and humiliation had nearly broken me. More than that, I described the years before, the gaslighting, the dismissals, the way Harold convinced police to leave when I begged for help. It was not just one night, I said, my voice cracking, but carrying through the silence. It was years of being told I did not matter. And when he left me in that forest, I realized that if I did not fight for myself, no one else ever would. The courtroom was silent, even the judge leaning forward. I pulled out my notebook, the one filled with years of records, and handed it to Claire, who submitted copies as evidence. My voice gained strength as I explained how I had documented every bruise, every threat, how I had learned from Daniel to back up recordings, how I had collected proof because experience taught me no one would believe me otherwise. I played the recording from the night David followed me in his truck, his voice threatening to bury me. The words echoed across the courtroom, his sneer preserved in digital permanence. His face reddened at the table, his lawyer objecting half-heartedly but overruled. Then came the testimony from the cafe. Patrons described how David had stormed in, how he threatened me loudly, how Evelyn snapped a photo at the exact moment his rage spilled out. Daniel corroborated his calm testimony, describing not only that day but also the coaching he had given me, his belief that evidence was my shield. One by one, the pieces fit together until even the most skeptical juror could not ignore the pattern. The defense tried to paint me as dramatic, attention-seeking, exaggerating sibling rivalry. Harold testified, his booming voice, insisting David was misunderstood, that I was fragile and prone to overreaction. Donna cried on cue, claiming she had never seen David hurt me, that I must have mistaken his protective nature for violence. But cross-examination stripped their lies bare. Records of police calls I had made were displayed. Reports of Harold's influence in town were raised. The jury's eyes shifted from sympathy to suspicion as the defense unraveled. Emotional undulation reached its peak as closing arguments began. The prosecutor reminded the jury of the photographs, the medical reports, the recordings. She asked them to imagine lying in the woods abandoned by your own brother, to imagine what it meant to be silenced for years and finally gather the courage to speak. The defense tried to claw back ground, but their words sounded hollow against the mountain of evidence. When the jury left to deliberate, the room buzzed with tension. I sat gripping the edge of my seat, Margaret's hand clasping mine, Daniel steady on my other side. Hours passed each minute, dragging like an eternity, until finally the jury filed back in. The foreman stood reading the verdicts aloud. Guilty on charges of assault, guilty on charges of reckless endangerment, guilty on charges of making criminal threats. My breath caught tears springing to my eyes as the words sank in. David's face drained of color, his composure cracking, while Harold and Donna sat stunned, their empire of denial collapsing in public view. The judge pronounced sentencing would follow, but already the outcome was clear. David would serve time, Harold and Donna would face the court of public opinion, and the truth I had carried for years in silence had finally been validated in the harsh light of justice. As we stepped out of the courthouse into the sunlight, reporters swarmed cameras, flashing questions flying. I ignored them all, focusing only on the warmth of Margaret's embrace, Evelyn's proud smile, Daniel's quiet nod. The world now knew the truth, but more importantly, I had reclaimed my voice. For once, justice had not just been a word, it had been lived, spoken, and delivered. The days after the trial felt strangely quiet, as if the world itself had exhaled after holding its breath for years and for the first time since childhood. I woke each morning without the suffocating weight of wondering how David might lash out, or how my parents would dismiss my pain. Instead, I rose to the sound of waves brushing the shore near Margaret's house, the scent of coffee drifting from the kitchen, the knowledge that my scars were no longer secrets, but testimony that had carried consequences. David was sentenced to prison. His swagger, stripped his future, narrowed to concrete walls and numbered days, and though Harold and Donna were not behind bars, they faced something almost worse in their world, the collapse of their social standing. Neighbors who once admired them crossed streets to avoid them. Whispers chased them through grocery aisles, and for the first time they were forced to taste the isolation they had long inflicted on me. Yet victory did not taste of revenge. It tasted of relief of the slow untangling of chains that had bound me for too long. On the morning after sentencing, I stood outside the courthouse with sunlight warm on my face. Evelyn beside me, Daniel steady at my shoulder, Margaret holding my hand. Reporters shouted questions, but their words faded into the background, drowned out by the quiet realization that I had survived. Not just the night in the woods, not just years of gaslighting, but the trial that exposed every wound I had carried. And I was still here, still standing. The weeks that followed were filled with small beginnings. Margaret and I planted flowers in her garden, bright bursts of color pushing through soil like promises of rebirth. Daniel helped repair the porch, his laughter softening the edges of his usually reserved demeanor, and in those moments I realized how much he had become a constant in my life, not as a savior, but as a partner who believed in me when I could barely believe in myself. Evelyn continued her truck routes, but stopped often at the cafe, where we shared coffee and stories, her presence a reminder that strangers could become family when blood failed. Healing was not a straight line. Some nights, I still woke with the echo of David's threats in my ears, sweat dampening my skin, my heart racing as though I was once again crawling through the woods. But now, when I sat on the porch under the stars, I was not alone. Margaret would hum softly. Daniel would sit in silence beside me. Evelyn would call to check in. Each of them reminded me I no longer carried the weight by myself. Slowly, I began to dream of more than survival. With Margaret's encouragement, I enrolled in evening classes at the community center, dipping my toes back into education, something I had once been denied. At first, I doubted myself, convinced years of fear had eroded my mind, but as weeks passed, I discovered the spark remained. Knowledge came back. The thrill of learning revived, and with each completed assignment, I reclaimed pieces of the girl my grandmother once believed in. Financial independence grew as well. I saved wages from the cafe, opened a small account in my own name, no longer hidden, but celebrated. Each dollar was a declaration that I would never again hand my life over to those who sought to erase me. The scars on my body faded into pale reminders, but the scars inside took longer, yet even they began to transform. Instead of shame, they became symbols, each one a marker of survival, each one proof that I had faced the storm and emerged. The town's perception of me shifted too. Customers at the cafe sometimes approached, telling me quietly that they had followed the trial, that they admired my courage. Older women squeezed my hand and said they wished they had spoken up in their own marriages or families. Men nodded solemnly, their eyes heavy with recognition that silence had protected abusers for too long. Their words reminded me that my story was not just mine. It resonated because it echoed across countless lives. In time, I was invited to speak at a local support group for survivors of domestic violence. My voice shook as I told my story, but when I saw the tears and nods of women who understood, I realized speaking aloud was another step in healing. I was no longer a victim telling a tale of pain. I was a survivor offering proof that survival was possible. Daniel often sat in the back of those meetings, his presence quiet but grounding, and when our eyes met, I felt gratitude deeper than words. Months rolled into a year, and life became not about what had been taken from me, but what I was building anew. One spring morning, Daniel and I planted a tree by the shore, its roots digging into sand and soil, its branches reaching toward the sky. As we stood back to look at it, wind tugging at my hair, I whispered the words that had carried me since the woods. He left me to die there, but from that night I found the path to live. Daniel squeezed my hand, his eyes soft with understanding. Margaret smiled from the porch. Evelyn honked her truck horn from the road, and in that simple moment, I knew I had a family again, one chosen, one earned. Justice had not erased the past, but it had rewritten the ending. I was free, and freedom meant more than absence of fear. It meant the presence of possibility. As I looked toward the horizon, the waves glittering under sunlight, I promised myself that my life would not be defined by what David tried to destroy, but by what I chose to create. Healing, love, truth, and a future that was mine alone. That was the real victory.